Well, the Te Runga Games are an incredible event, really. It's every 4 years. It's the national games of Kiribati, and so it's not just football, but obviously that's what I tend to focus on the most. It's other sports as well, but from our purposes, what's really exciting is you have a football championships in Kiribati, and for a lot of people, I imagine Kiribati isn't a place you know a huge amount about, and that would have been the same for me some years ago till I sort of came into that part of the world. There are 32 atolls, I believe, in Kiribati, and then one other island that isn't technically an atoll, but that's very technical. But basically, what matters is you have 23, I believe, inhabited atolls that compete in a football tournament in Tarawa, the biggest island. And so 23 teams have to come in either by boat or by small plane to take part in this national tournament that takes part every 4 years. Now, what was weird this year? This is on men's and women's side. They do this tournament, and what was weird this year was that until about 10 days ago, Kiribati were headed for the Pacific Games, which is the big tournament taking part in the region. That's going on in Samoa. And they'd even been put in a group, and they were going to be, the men's team were going to be competing, and it looked quite daunting, their draw. But they were training for it. They had games between Kiribati's sort of like probable squad and people, other people on the islands that they could get to play against them, basically, and things like that. So it looked very much like, this was what was going to happen, that they were going to Pacific Games. And just very suddenly they pulled out and they were taken out of the draw. And no one could really understand what had happened. And what had happened was that they hadn't realized Te Runga was taking place. And Te Runga is more important to people there, I think, than the Pacific Games. It's a chance to, for these very small islands to compete and to be it's this very big part of the culture. So they basically pulled out of the Pacific Games in order to make sure Te Runga took place. And if you see any videos or pictures from it, it's an amazing event. There's just people everywhere watching these games and on these incredibly rock hard pitches. They look formidable rock hard pitches in Kiribati. But people absolutely love it. And sadly, my favourites, Christmas Island, or it's kind of spelt Kiribati, but it's Christmas Island, were eliminated because they were the ones that I like to cheer on. And that's partly just because in Kiribati Island, there is a place called London and a place called Paris and a place called Banana.
Banana,
Yeah.
brilliant.
So I always cheer them on. But no, they're out. They're out now. But it's an incredible event.
One thing that we at the Sweeper love is obviously teams traveling long distances to play football matches. And I must admit, before we came into this episode, I didn't really know anything about Kiribati. But I found out that the distance between its eastern and westernmost points is 4,564 kilometers, which is roughly the same distance from London to Nova Scotia in Canada. So, I mean, how do they do this? I presume that they don't have much funding to get all of the sort of coaches, players, teams, stuff across. So this must be very expensive.
Yeah, it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. Because it's Te Runga, there are funds they can dip into. There are players, I believe, representing their islands who normally live on Tarawa, the biggest island. So most people do tend to gravitate towards Tarawa at certain points in their lives, I think, if they're from Kiribati. So it's a bit like if you had a team representing Blackburn and you could pick people from London who are from Blackburn, there is a way to get around flying literally everyone. But as far as I understand it, a vast number of people have come over on small boats, which are pretty dicey journeys. They're not journeys you want to make. It's a fascinating battle against the odds because they don't get a lot of funding. They are an OFC associate member, so they're the lowest level of member that you can be in a federation, and they get very little funding. They get about, I think, 30,000 US dollars, no, a bit later, but 30,000 Aussie dollars, I think, per year, and that's it. And I think a lot of that is prescribed. They have to buy certain equipment with it. Their goal is to get full membership, which obviously makes a huge difference. But whether they can do that, I'm not sure. And pulling out of the Pacific Games is not necessarily a good look if you want to be talking to OFC about membership. It may be seen as actually quite a negative step. That.
I just want to come back to something you said before, which I found quite funny. So they didn't realize that the Pacific Games and the Te Runga Games were taking place at the same time. These should be pretty prominent events in their calendar, shouldn't they?
That's all I've been told. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. You'd have thought it's a bit like the Olympic year and not realizing there's a football tournament that's going to clash with it. I'm not entirely sure. It's for Kiribati a fascinating place. I mean, they've not played a game since Pacific Games in 2011 as a national team, but I've had a fair amount of contact with them with my work in Micronesia, and there are some amazing people working on that in that FA, but there's a real sense of them not necessarily getting a lot of guidance and a lot of help, despite the fact they finally got into this big moment where they got into FIFA or into OFC, into FIFA sort of realms. They're not getting a lot of help. They also tragically lost the president of the Kiribati Football Federation, Kiribati Islands Football Federation. He passed away relatively young last year. In fact, not last year, a few months ago. Martin Tofinger, and he did a huge amount of the work on getting football there where it needs to be. And yeah, he passed away quite suddenly. It's left a real gap. He was a real powerhouse, actually. I think possibly it's his loss that's caused some of this, maybe this confusion, because that was a big problem for them to be dealing with that just months before the team should have left.